Funny how the room gets real quiet when the man you laughed at becomes the one signing your report. The booking area at South Precinct never really slept. It only changed moods. Near midnight, the place hummed with fluorescent light and stale coffee, with the soft grind of a printer spitting out intake forms and the metallic buzz of locked doors opening and closing down the corridor. Deputies moved in practiced patterns, sliding paperwork across scratched counters, checking names against screens, speaking in clipped voices that sounded more tired than cruel, though sometimes it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. At the far end of the room, a young man in handcuffs sat on a plastic bench with his eyes fixed on the floor, while a public defender flipped through a file under a flickering light. Everything in the room felt worn down by repetition, by long shifts, by too many people seeing too much of the worst in one another. That was exactly why Lieutenant Marcus Reed noticed the tone before he noticed the faces. He stepped through the side entrance wearing a dark overcoat over a plain dress shirt, carrying a slim black folder tucked beneath one arm, and paused just long enough to take in the room the way experienced officers did, without making it obvious. The booking desk was backed up. 2 intake forms were left unsigned. 1 body camera sat uncharged beside a coffee-stained clipboard. A detainee property bag had been labeled in a hurry, the handwriting nearly unreadable. Small things, maybe, but small things were usually where bigger problems started. Marcus moved toward the front counter with the calm, measured posture of a man who had spent years learning that some rooms tested you before they ever welcomed you. Before he could speak, Officer Dylan Shaw looked up from the terminal, leaned back in his chair, and gave Marcus a slow once-over that landed somewhere between boredom and contempt. "You lost, man?" he asked, not loudly, but loudly enough. Officer Brett Collins, standing nearby with a paper cup in one hand, smirked without even trying to hide it. Marcus kept his expression neutral. "I'm here to review the booking floor," he said. Simple. Professional. Enough for any reasonable officer to respond with a question, maybe even a nod. But Shaw only let out a dry laugh and spun halfway toward Collins. "Review the booking floor," he repeated, like the words themselves were a joke. "That right." Collins chuckled into his cup. "Guess they're sending all kinds of people down here now." A few heads turned. No one stepped in. No one ever did at first. Marcus stood still, his eyes moving once across the room, not in discomfort, but in assessment. He saw the young officer by the fingerprint station suddenly become very interested in a stack of forms. He saw the desk sergeant glance up and then glance away. He saw how quickly silence could become permission in a place like this. Shaw tapped the counter with 2 fingers. "Booking area runs just fine without outside help," he said. Then his mouth twisted into something that barely qualified as a smile. "Unless this is one of those image cleanup things. In that case, welcome aboard." Collins laughed harder this time, and even the public defender looked up from her file. Marcus felt the familiar weight of the moment settle over the room, the kind that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with assumption. But he did not raise his voice. He did not flinch. He only rested the folder on the counter, looked directly at Shaw, and said, "I'm just here to see how this place runs." And for reasons none of them understood yet, that calm answer landed heavier than anger ever could. Marcus did not move right away after he said it. He let the silence sit there, not because he was intimidated, but because silence had a way of revealing people faster than questions ever could. Officer Dylan Shaw gave a short laugh and turned back to his computer as if the conversation had already been decided in his favor. Officer Brett Collins stayed leaning against the counter, one shoulder relaxed, the paper cup still in his hand, enjoying the moment the way some men enjoyed any room where somebody else had been made smaller. Across the booking floor, a detainee cleared his throat softly, and the public defender lowered her eyes to the file in front of her, pretending to read while the tension drifted through the fluorescent air like static. Marcus rested one hand on the folder and took in the room again, this time slower. He noticed the intake board mounted beside the wall clock. 3 names were written in black marker. One had no time entered beside it. Another had no initials from the transporting officer. At the far station, a property tray sat half open with a wallet and a set of keys still waiting to be logged. Small oversights in a busy shift, maybe, or signs of a team that had gotten too comfortable with cutting corners because nobody had forced them to slow down and look. "You planning to stand there all night?" Shaw asked without looking up. Because unless you are here to mop floors or move boxes, I have actual work to do. Collins snorted into his drink. Marcus met neither man with anger nor embarrassment. He had been in rooms like this before, rooms where men mistook restraint for weakness because they had never learned the difference between noise and authority. Then do it correctly, Marcus said. Not sharp, not loud, just level. Shaw stopped typing. His chair creaked as he leaned back again, this time turning fully toward Marcus. Excuse me. Marcus lifted the folder and opened it halfway, glancing at the first page only for a second before closing it again. 2 intake forms are incomplete. 1 property bag is not sealed. Your body camera charging station has 1 unit offline, and your board is missing a timestamp on an active booking. That is not actual work done correctly. That is work waiting to become a problem. The room changed after that. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Collins straightened a little. The younger officer by the fingerprint station looked over again, this time more carefully. Even Shaw blinked, not because he accepted the correction, but because he had not expected it. He covered it quickly with a smirk. Look at that, he said, spreading his hands. We got ourselves an expert. Then he tilted his head, eyes narrowing. Tell me something. They send you down here because of the complaints? Or because somebody upstairs thought this place needed a better photo for the annual report? The comment landed exactly the way he intended it to. Ugly enough to sting, indirect enough to let him deny it if challenged. Collins let out a low laugh. One of the clerks froze for half a second over her keyboard. Marcus felt the old pressure rise in his chest. Not rage, not fear, but that familiar tightening that came when a man knew he was being tested in a way that had nothing to do with skill. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked past Shaw toward the bench near the holding door where the young detainee still sat with both hands folded tightly in his lap. The kid could not have been more than 19. He looked exhausted, confused, and painfully aware of every word spoken around him. That, more than anything, sharpened Marcus's focus. Because whatever this room had become for the officers working in it, for the people brought through those doors, it was often the first face of the justice system they would ever remember. And tonight, that face looked careless. Shaw pushed himself to his feet and stepped around the desk with a confidence built on habit. Here is how this place runs, he said. People come in, paperwork gets done, and everybody who is not assigned down here stays out of the way. He glanced at the black folder in Marcus's hand. So unless your next move is making copies, I suggest you quit pretending you belong behind this counter. Marcus looked at him for a long moment, calm as ever, then shifted his gaze to the clock on the wall. 12 minutes to midnight. Right on schedule. Somewhere down the hall, heels clicked against the tile floor, measured and deliberate, and before anyone in the room could place the sound, Marcus closed the folder, folded his hands behind his back, and waited. The footsteps grew louder, crisp and controlled against the tile, and the effect on the room was immediate even before the source appeared. Conversations thinned. A clerk set down her pen. The younger officer by the fingerprint station straightened his back as if instinct had moved before thought. Officer Dylan Shaw did not turn right away, perhaps because men like him often believed a room belonged to them until someone stronger proved otherwise. Marcus Reed remained exactly where he was, his hands folded behind his back, his expression unreadable under the hard wash of fluorescent light. Then Captain Elena Brooks stepped into the booking area with the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself twice. She was followed by a lieutenant from Internal Affairs and a civilian compliance supervisor carrying a tablet and a sealed envelope. That detail alone changed the air. Not many people came into a precinct this close to midnight unless something had already gone wrong. Captain Brooks stopped 3 feet from the front counter and swept the room with one measured look. All booking personnel, listen up, she said. Her voice was not raised, but every person in the room heard it. This is an administrative transition effective immediately. Shaw turned then, half smile already fading. Collins lowered his cup. The clerk nearest the printer quietly pushed her chair back under the desk. Marcus did not move. Captain Brooks extended her hand toward him, not for a handshake, but in formal recognition. Lieutenant Marcus Reed has been assigned to oversee booking operations beginning tonight, she said. He will be supervising procedural compliance, intake documentation, detainee handling standards, and staff review during the department audit. For one long second, nobody spoke. The printer kept humming. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang and rang. But inside that room, the silence felt complete, almost physical. Shaw's face changed first. Not dramatically, not in some theatrical collapse, but in the smallest, most revealing ways. His jaw set. The confidence left his eyes. The easy contempt that had carried him all evening seemed to drain out of him so fast, it almost looked like confusion. Collins stared at Marcus, then at Captain Brooks, then back again as if trying to find some angle where this made sense without forcing him to confront what had just happened. Captain Brooks continued as though none of their reactions mattered, which in truth they did not. Lieutenant Reed is also serving as lead evaluator on the unresolved complaints connected to this floor, she said. That includes intake, irregularities, missing timestamps, body camera compliance, and reported concerns regarding professionalism in contact with detainees, attorneys, and fellow officers. At that, the young public defender on the bench looked up fully for the first time. Her eyes moved from Marcus to Shaw, and something in her expression hardened into recognition, as though pieces she had sensed but never proven had suddenly clicked into place. Captain Brooks took the sealed envelope from the compliance supervisor and handed it to Marcus. Your temporary command authorization and audit schedule, she said. Marcus accepted it with a small nod. Thank you, Captain. His voice remained calm, almost quiet, yet now every syllable carried a different weight because the room finally understood what had been standing in front of it all along. Shaw swallowed once and stepped back behind the counter, as if the desk itself might still protect him. Captain, he said, forcing a strained half-laugh. Nobody told us. Brooks turned her head just enough to look at him directly. That is correct, Officer Shaw, she said. And sometimes that is the point. The words landed harder than a public reprimand. Marcus opened the envelope, scanned the first page, and then closed it again. He did not look triumphant. He did not smirk. He did not search Shaw's face for satisfaction. Instead, he turned slowly toward the intake board, the unsealed property tray, the unsigned forms, the waiting detainee, the exhausted clerk, the whole strained machinery of a room that had forgotten the difference between routine and respect. When he finally spoke, it was not with anger. It was with authority sharpened by restraint. From this moment on, he said, everything in this room gets done by policy, by the book, and with dignity. We are going to slow down, clean this up, and remember that every person who comes through here is still a human being. No one laughed then. No one looked away. Because the man they had tried to reduce to a joke had just become the standard by which they were all about to be measured. Marcus did not waste the silence. The moment after authority is recognized is often the moment when a room decides whether it will change or merely pretend to. He set the sealed envelope beside the terminal, removed his overcoat with unhurried precision, and draped it over the back of an empty chair. The gesture was simple, but it carried a message stronger than any speech. He was not passing through. He was staying. Captain Elena Brooks remained near the entrance with the Internal Affairs Lieutenant and the Compliance Supervisor, observing without interference, giving the floor to the man they had placed in charge. Marcus stepped toward the intake board and uncapped a black marker from the tray below it. He filled in the missing timestamp beside the open booking, then turned to the property station where the unsealed bag still lay waiting. Who logged this item? He asked. His voice was level, free of accusation, but every person in the room felt the question land like a spotlight. A clerk named Jenna Morales raised her hand halfway from behind the side desk, her face pale with embarrassment. I was waiting on the second signature, Lieutenant, she said. Marcus nodded once. Then it should not have been left open. He sealed the bag carefully, checked the label, and placed it back in the tray. We do not leave chain of custody to memory. We document it, because memory changes when pressure enters the room. The compliance supervisor typed something into her tablet. That sound alone seemed to tighten every shoulder on the floor. Officer Dylan Shaw stood rigid behind the counter, saying nothing now, though resentment had not left him. It was there in the way his jaw flexed, in the way his fingers tapped once against the edge of the desk before going still. Marcus could feel it without looking directly at him. Men like Shaw did not surrender arrogance all at once. They retreated into it, folded it into silence, and waited for a chance to call fairness humiliation. Marcus knew that pattern too well to be distracted by it. He moved next to the charging station and lifted the disconnected body camera with 2 fingers. Who was assigned Unit 12, he asked. Collins cleared his throat. That one was mine. Marcus set the camera down and met his eyes for the first time since the reveal. Then tonight you will write an equipment variance before you leave. Collins opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it when Marcus added, not because I enjoy paperwork. Because when accountability is optional, dignity becomes optional too. The words settled into the room with an unexpected weight. Even the young detainee on the bench looked up again, this time not with fear, but with cautious attention, as though he had never expected to hear someone inside a precinct talk about dignity at all. Marcus walked over to the bench and crouched just enough to bring himself to eye level without making a show of it. You have been waiting how long? He asked. The young man blinked. About an hour, sir. Maybe a little more. Marcus stood and turned to the board. The missing timestamp made the answer impossible to verify. He let that fact speak for itself. Captain Brooks folded her arms. The Internal Affairs lieutenant said nothing, but the look he gave the board was colder than any lecture. Authority, but because he was using it in a way none of them had expected. He was not grandstanding. He was not humiliating anyone for sport. He was making them look at details they had trained themselves not to see. Collins shifted uncomfortably and rubbed the back of his neck. The swagger he had borrowed from Shaw earlier was gone now, replaced by the uneasy awareness that he had laughed at a man who understood the room better than anyone in it. Marcus set the unsigned form down and moved to the corner where the camera feed monitor displayed a grid of grainy hallways and booking stations. One screen flickered at uneven intervals before going dark for a second and returning. He pointed at it. How long has that camera been dropping signal? Shaw answered this time, though his voice lacked its earlier edge. Maintenance said they were working on it. Marcus turned his head slowly. When? Shaw hesitated. Last week. Maybe earlier. Marcus let the answer sit in the air. Then until it is fixed, that blind spot gets documented at the beginning of every shift and reported at the end of every shift. Not assumed. Not forgotten. Documented. He looked around the room, making sure every person heard the next part. You cannot ask the public to trust your process if you are casual with your own weak points. That sentence seemed to strike deeper than the procedural corrections had. Because now he was not only talking about forms and cameras and property bags. He was talking about culture. The kind of culture that begins with little jokes, careless habits, tired eyes, and private assumptions, then slowly hardens into a system where some people are treated with patience and others are treated like interruptions. Marcus knew that pattern. He had seen it as a rookie, seen it as a sergeant, seen it in rooms where his rank earned him silence only after his skin had first earned him doubt. Shaw crossed his arms. You make it sound like everything in here is broken. Marcus faced him fully. No, he said. I am saying something more uncomfortable than that. Most of it works well enough to hide what is broken. Nobody spoke after that. Not Collins. Not Jenna. Not even the clerk near the printer. Because those words did what the earlier reveal had only begun to do. They forced the room to understand that this was not about one insult or one bad shift. This was about what people become when they stop seeing the human cost of their own shortcuts. Marcus picked up the black folder again, opened it, and scanned the first audit page under the hum of the fluorescent lights. Then he closed it gently and looked at the team before him. We are going to review every intake from the last 72 hours, he said. And before this shift ends, every person in this room is going to decide whether professionalism is something they perform when supervisors are watching or something they carry when nobody is impressed. The room did not fall apart after Marcus Reed issued the review order. In some ways, that was the clearest sign of how long the problems had been living there. The printers still fed paper. The wall clock still clicked forward 1 minute at a time. The holding door still buzzed open and shut as deputies moved detainees through the narrow corridor. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of the booking floor, something more difficult had begun. People were no longer working on autopilot. They were working under the weight of being seen. Jenna Morales pulled intake files from the last 72 hours and stacked them in neat columns across the side desk, her earlier embarrassment now replaced by the fierce concentration of someone trying to prove she had not become careless on purpose. The public defender spoke quietly with Caleb Turner at the bench while Collins carried a portable charger to the dead body camera station without being told twice. Even Captain Elena Brooks, who had remained mostly silent, shifted her position just enough to make it clear she was not leaving anytime soon. Marcus moved through the room with a controlled pace, opening one file after another, checking signatures, timestamps, custody entries, and transport logs. He did not rush. He did not perform outrage for anyone's benefit. And because he did not raise his voice, every correction seemed to land harder. A missed witness line here. An intake note without a disposition code there. A property sheet with handwriting so rushed it could have belonged to almost anyone. Piece by piece, the room had to confront the truth Marcus had named earlier. Nothing was failing in some dramatic, television-ready way. It was something quieter than that. The system had been allowed to become sloppy in the exact places where human dignity depends on discipline. Officer Dylan Shaw lingered behind the main terminal longer than necessary, pretending to review transport logs while clearly listening to every word Marcus said. Resentment still sat on him like a second uniform. Marcus could sense it even when his back was turned. The man had lost the room, but he had not surrendered the belief that he had been wronged. That, Marcus knew, was often the final shield of people who had spent too long mistaking unchecked comfort for earned authority. Near 1 a.m, the holding door opened again, and an elderly man was escorted in by a patrol officer from another unit. He looked tired, confused, and cold, his thin jacket no match for the overnight chill that had settled over the city. The escorting officer handed over the transport slip with only half the required fields complete and started to turn away. Marcus stopped him with a single sentence. "Officer, finish the transfer before you leave." The patrol officer froze, glanced at Shaw, then at Marcus. "I thought they could handle the rest down here." Marcus held out the clipboard. "That assumption is part of the problem." There was no anger in the words, but there was no space to argue either. The officer took the clipboard back and completed the missing information under Marcus's watch. Caleb Turner, still seated on the bench with his attorney, followed the exchange with the quiet attention of someone seeing authority used differently than he had expected. It mattered, Marcus thought. Maybe not to everyone in the room. Maybe not in a way that would make a headline. But to the people forced to sit on those benches and wait under fluorescent lights while strangers decided how carefully or carelessly their names would be handled, it mattered. Collins returned from the charging station and placed the powered unit back on the rack. "Camera is good now, Lieutenant," he said. Marcus looked at him. "Thank you." Collins blinked at the simple civility of it, as if he had braced for something harsher. Marcus understood that too. Too many people believed accountability had to sound like humiliation because humiliation was the only leadership they had ever respected. But there was another way to run a room. A harder way, in some respects, because it required control instead of ego. Jenna approached with 3 files in both hands. "Lieutenant, these are the ones with missing witness signatures," she said. Marcus flipped through them quickly. 3 files from 2 different shifts. Same omission. Same initials in the corner of the intake sheet. He raised his eyes. "Officer Shaw," he said. Shaw turned slowly. "These are yours." It was not a question. Shaw looked at the files, then at Marcus, then gave a short laugh with no real amusement in it. "So now we are doing archaeology?" The old swagger was back for a second. Thinner now, frayed at the edges, but still there. A few people in the room went still. Marcus stepped closer, close enough to make it impossible for Shaw to pretend the conversation was casual, but not so close that it became theater. "No," he said. "We are doing what should have been done the first time. We are making the record match the responsibility." Shaw's eyes narrowed. "And if I say this is overkill?" Marcus held his gaze without blinking. "Then I will say something you should have learned long before tonight. Procedure feels excessive only to people who think the rules are for someone else." The words settled over the booking floor and stayed there. Nobody laughed. Nobody came to Shaw's defense. Because by then, even the people who had laughed with him earlier could see the deeper thing unfolding. This was no longer about a single insult made to the wrong man. It was about whether the people wearing the badge in that room would choose pride over principle when the two could no longer hide inside each other. Officer Dylan Shaw opened his mouth as if he still had one more line left to save himself. One more joke sharp enough to cut the tension and return the room to the version of itself he understood. But the room had changed too much for that. The younger officer by the fingerprint station was no longer avoiding eye contact. Jenna Morales had stopped. Moving like someone trying not to be noticed, and had begun moving like someone who understood that careful work was not punishment but protection. Even Brett Collins, who had spent the first part of the night feeding off Shaw's confidence, now kept his eyes on the files in front of him as though he were finally embarrassed by how easy it had been to laugh when the target was someone he thought could not answer back. Marcus Reed let the silence stretch just long enough for Shaw to hear what was missing from it. No support, no chorus, no one rushing in to soften the moment for him. That was when Captain Elena Brooks stepped forward from the doorway, her expression steady, her hands folded in front of her duty belt. "Officer Shaw," she said, "you will remain available for review through the end of this shift." Shaw turned toward her too quickly. "Captain, with respect, this is getting blown out of proportion." The phrase hung in the air, familiar and tired, the kind of sentence people reached for when they sensed consequences coming and wanted to rename them exaggeration. Brooks did not blink. "What is being reviewed tonight is not one mistake," she said. "It is a pattern." Marcus saw the words hit Shaw harder than anger would have. Patterns were harder to deny because they made a man confront not what slipped once, but what had become normal inside him. Shaw glanced toward the counter, the intake board, the half-straightened stacks of paper, the camera station, as if maybe somewhere in the room there was still an easier story to tell about himself. Marcus knew that search. He had watched it happen before in classrooms, briefing rooms, court waiting areas, and hallways where men said something ugly with a smile and then looked stunned when the world refused to laugh with them forever. A pattern of what? Shaw asked, though his voice had lost force. Internal Affairs Lieutenant Raymond Hale answered before Brooks could. Missing documentation, incomplete transfer records, repeated witness signature omissions, and conduct concerns tied to this floor over multiple shifts. Then he paused, letting the next words come out with deliberate clarity. And based on witness statements already submitted, possible bias in how certain detainees and personnel were addressed. At that, something passed through the room that could not be measured on a report. The clerk nearest the printer went still. The public defender slowly closed her file. Caleb Turner, still seated on the bench, lifted his eyes from the floor again, and Marcus could see the question in them without hearing it spoken. So somebody noticed. So somebody finally said it out loud. Shaw let out a breath through his nose, but there was no laugh in it this time. "You are really going to do this over a misunderstanding?" Marcus stepped in then, not to crush him, not to humiliate him in front of the room the way Shaw had tried to do earlier, but to pin the truth where everyone could see it. "No," he said. "What happens next is because too many misunderstandings have been allowed to grow into habit." He looked around the booking area as he spoke, making sure the words belonged to everyone, not just Shaw. The problem is not only the comment that gets heard. It is the culture that makes people comfortable saying it. It is the silence that follows. It is the paperwork left incomplete because some people believe details matter less when the person on the bench does not look important. It is the confidence to assume who belongs and who does not before asking a single honest question. Nobody moved. Even the fluorescent hum overhead seemed louder now that every person in the room understood this was no longer only an audit. It was a mirror. Marcus turned to Caleb. "Mr. Turner, thank you for your patience tonight." Then to the public defender. "Counselor, he will receive an accurate status update before another minute passes." She gave one small nod, more respectful than cautious now. Marcus faced the room again. "I want every open file cross-checked against transport logs and body camera assignments in the next 20 minutes, he said. "Then we begin interviews, one at a time." Collins swallowed. Jenna picked up her pen. The younger officer by the fingerprint station pulled a chair to the side desk and opened a binder without being told. Shaw remained where he was, but something essential had shifted in his face. Not surrender exactly. More like the first painful crack in a version of himself that had gone unchallenged too long. Marcus did not take pleasure in that. He had no interest in revenge dressed up as leadership. What he wanted was harder than that and more rare. He wanted the room to remember what power was for. Not to sort human worth in real time. Not to reward ego. Not to turn exhaustion into cruelty. But to protect order without stripping people of their dignity in the process. Captain Brooks watched him for a long moment, then gave a subtle nod that almost nobody else noticed. She had seen what the others were only beginning to understand. Marcus Reed had not taken control of the room when she announced his position. He had taken control of it the moment he refused to become smaller just because they expected him to. The interviews began at 1:30 in the morning, not in some dramatic back office with raised voices and slammed folders, but right there inside the booking area where the truth had already started doing its work. Marcus Reed chose the side desk closest to the intake board, where every person waiting could still see the flow of the room, and every officer could feel that this process was not hidden, not personal, and not theatrical. It was procedural, transparent, deliberate. One chair for the officer being interviewed, one for Marcus. Captain Elena Brooks remained within sight, speaking quietly at intervals with Internal Affairs Lieutenant Raymond Hale, while the compliance supervisor documented every corrective action entered into the audit log. Brett Collins went first. He sat stiffly, elbows close to his ribs, hands resting flat on his thighs like a man trying not to fidget and failing anyway. Marcus asked short, direct questions. Who had cleared the open property tray? Why had the body camera remained offline? When had he last verified the charging rack against shift assignment? Collins answered without attitude now. He admitted he had relied too often on habit, on assumptions, on the idea that if the room kept moving then nothing serious could be wrong. Marcus wrote notes in clean, measured lines and asked him one final question before ending the interview. When Officer Shaw made those remarks earlier, why did you laugh? Collins looked down at the floor for a long moment. When he finally answered, his voice had gone smaller. Because it was easier than stopping him. Marcus did not shame him for that answer. He only said, easy choices build bad cultures faster than loud ones do. Collins nodded once, as though the sentence had found a place in him he had been trying not to examine. Jenna Morales came next and admitted she had stopped correcting minor errors on the floor because nobody wanted to be the person who slowed everything down. The younger officer from Fingerprints confessed that he had noticed mismatched intake times before, but had convinced himself it was above his pay grade to challenge. The pattern grew clearer with every interview. Nobody had set out to become cruel. That was the part that unsettled the room most. The harm had not come wrapped in obvious villainy. It had come through fatigue, silence, habits, jokes, and the quiet confidence that somebody else would draw the line later. Officer Dylan Shaw sat last. By then the clock above the intake board read 2:12 in the morning, and the booking floor felt different from the room Marcus had entered earlier that night. Not kinder exactly, but more honest. Shaw lowered himself into the chair across from Marcus with the guarded expression of a man who still believed dignity meant never looking shaken. Marcus opened the file in front of him and kept his tone even. These witness signature omissions are attached to your shifts. The missing timestamps overlap with your transfer log. And multiple statements describe comments from you that go beyond unprofessional. Shaw said nothing. Marcus let the quiet hold. Then Shaw gave a slow exhale and looked toward the holding bench where Caleb Turner now sat with a cup of water and his attorney beside him. You want me to say I am racist? He asked, not with challenge this time, but with the strained confusion of someone hearing his own life named in words he had spent years avoiding. Marcus leaned back slightly. I want you to understand that bias does not begin where accountability ends, he said. Sometimes it begins in what a man feels entitled to assume. Who he questions first, who he explains things to, who he talks over, who he jokes about when he thinks the room will support him. Shaw swallowed, his gaze still not fully steady. That is not what I meant. Marcus's voice remained calm. Meaning matters, but impact matters too. And leadership fails the second it starts protecting intent more than people. The room stayed quiet around them. No one pretended not to listen now. Even the clerks had paused their sorting to hear what happened next. Shaw looked down at his own hands as if they belonged to somebody he had not examined closely in years. I never thought about it like that, he said. Marcus studied him for a moment, weighing the sentence, not for perfection, but for truth. That, he said softly, is the problem. Shaw closed his eyes for one brief second and nodded once, almost involuntarily, as though something in him had finally run out of places to hide. Marcus closed the file and did not press further. He was not interested in forcing a performance of remorse. That would have been too easy and too empty. Instead, he stood, placed both palms lightly on the desk, and addressed the entire room. What happens tonight does not end with discipline forms or retraining orders, he said. If that is all you hear, then you miss the point. The purpose of correction is not humiliation. It is restoration. It is making sure this room never again confuses speed with professionalism, silence with loyalty, or authority with the right to diminish another human being. He looked once toward Caleb, once toward Jenna, once toward Collins, and finally back to Shaw. Every person who comes through these doors is already carrying something. Fear, shame, anger, uncertainty. Our job is not to add contempt to that list. Nobody answered him. They did not need to, because by then the lesson had moved past policy and into something deeper, something harder to dismiss once heard. Under the buzzing lights of the booking floor, surrounded by forms, monitors, keys, and concrete walls, Marcus Reed had done more than take charge of a room. He had forced it to remember that respect was not a courtesy added when convenient. It was the first test of whether power deserved to be trusted at all. By the time the wall clock crept past 3 in the morning, the booking area no longer felt like the same room Marcus Reed had walked into a few hours earlier. The fluorescent lights were still harsh. The coffee was still burnt. The printers still fed out forms with the same tired mechanical rhythm. But the mood had changed in a way harder to measure and impossible to fake. People spoke more carefully now, not out of fear alone, but out of awareness. The kind that comes when a room has been forced to hear itself clearly. Caleb Turner had finally received a full status explanation from his attorney and the desk clerk, and when his release paperwork cleared, Marcus was the one who walked over with the final document in hand. Caleb stood slowly from the bench, shoulders stiff from hours under bad light and worse assumptions, and looked at Marcus with the guarded uncertainty of someone not yet sure whether respect offered this late could still be real. Marcus handed him the paper and said, "You should have been kept informed from the start. That did not happen, and that matters." Caleb looked down at the document, then back up. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. Marcus gave one small nod. "Get home safe." It was a simple exchange, barely a few seconds long, but everyone near the bench heard it. Jenna Morales heard it as she rechecked the intake log she had corrected twice already. Brett Collins heard it as he initialed the equipment variance form with a seriousness he had not shown all night before the audit began. Even Officer Dylan Shaw heard it, though he remained near the far counter, finishing his written statement with the posture of a man who understood that consequences were no longer theoretical. Internal Affairs Lieutenant Raymond Hale collected the first round of reports just after 3:15. The compliance supervisor finalized her notes and attached preliminary recommendations for retraining, procedural review, and supervisory follow-up on the booking floor. Captain Elena Brooks read the pages in silence, then closed the folder and looked around the room with the stern calm of someone who had seen departments either grow from moments like this or waste them entirely. "These findings will move forward at shift end," she said. "Corrective actions begin immediately." No one asked what that meant. They already knew. Some would be retrained. Some would be formally reviewed. Some would have to answer for habits they had mistaken for normal. But Marcus also knew that paperwork, on its own, would never be enough. Systems do not change because a form is filed. They change when enough people decide they are tired of pretending not to see what the form exists to name. He moved to the center of the booking floor one last time, the black folder tucked beneath his arm, and looked at every face in the room before speaking. Tonight was not about catching one person saying the wrong thing, he said. It was about what grows when disrespect is treated as harmless, when silence is treated as professionalism, and when shortcuts become the culture instead of the exception. His voice was not loud, but it carried with the weight of a truth earned rather than borrowed. A booking area is not just a room where paperwork gets processed. It is where people learn what kind of department they are dealing with. They learn it from your tone, from your patience, from whether you explain or dismiss, from whether you follow policy only when somebody important is watching, or because you understand that rules are how dignity survives pressure. The younger fingerprint officer lowered his eyes. Jenna held her pen still. Collins stood straighter. Shaw did not move at all. Marcus continued, and now there was something deeper in his expression, not anger, not triumph, but the hard steadiness of a man who had lived too long inside other people's assumptions to waste power once he finally held the room. "Some of you thought I did not belong here before you knew my rank," he said. "That matters. Not because my feelings need protection, but because every assumption you make too quickly becomes a standard you apply to someone with even less power than I had when I walked in. Tonight." The words stayed there after he said them. settling into the concrete and metal and buzzing light like something the building itself ought to remember. Captain Brooks gave him the floor without interruption because she understood what the others were learning in real time. This was not a speech about image. It was a line being drawn between authority and ego, between order and humiliation, between doing the job and hiding behind it. Marcus let the silence breathe for one more second before he finished. If you wear a badge long enough, people will mistake your access for your worth, he said. Do not make the same mistake about yourself. The badge gives you responsibility. The way you treat people is what tells the truth about your character. No one clapped. No one nodded dramatically. The room was too tired, too exposed, too honest for anything that neat. But something had shifted all the same. Caleb Turner walked out of the booking area and glanced back once before the holding door closed behind him. And in that single look was the quiet recognition that he had witnessed something rare inside a place built on authority. A man using power not to settle a score, but to restore a standard. Marcus picked up his overcoat, slid it over his shoulders, and turned back toward the intake board where the corrected times, signatures, and sealed entries now sat in order beneath the humming lights. It was only one night, one room, one shift. The city outside would still wake to sirens, traffic, and people carrying their own private reasons not to trust the system. But inside South Precinct, at least for that night, the lesson had landed where it needed to. Respect was not softness. Accountability was not cruelty. And the strongest person in the room had turned out to be the one who never needed to shout to prove he was in charge. Because in the end, the law means very little when it forgets the human being standing right in front of it.